The handsome groom, a man whose name commanded fear in the city's underworld, stood at the altar, his eyes as cold as the diamond on his bride's finger. This wedding was a treaty, a merger of empires, and he was its sacrifice. But then his gaze swept the room, a silent scream of a trapped soul, and locked onto the pastry chef at the back of the hall. In that instant, the carefully constructed peace between two rival families began to crumble. He didn't know her name, but he knew he couldn't marry the woman beside him. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in the kitchen of the Moretti estate was a battleground of scents. Rich vanilla from the buttercream frosting warred with the savory aroma of roasting lamb, while underneath it all lay the sharp metallic tang of pure, unadulterated stress. This was not a kitchen of joy, it was a command center on the verge of collapse. Amidst the chaos, Camila Mendoza was an island of calm. Her hands, steady and sure, moved with the practiced grace of a true artist. She was carefully placing the final spun sugar angel hair onto the croquembouche, a towering monument of cream-filled pastry and golden caramel that was her masterpiece. Each delicate puff was a testament to her focus, a small, perfect world she could control. She was here as a favor, a well-paid favor, to her friend Sophia. Sophia, whose catering business had landed the contract of a lifetime, was currently vibrating with an anxiety so potent Camila could feel it from across the stainless steel island. "Cammy, did you see the cars out front?" Sophia whispered, her voice tight as she frantically plated miniature cannolis. "Each one costs more than our apartments combined. They say the groom is some kind of big-shot importer, very powerful." Camila didn't look up from her work, her gaze fixed on a single, fragile strand of caramel. "Let's just make sure the desserts are perfect, Soph. That's all we need to worry about. The less we know about these people, the better." Her voice was low and soothing, a stark contrast to the clatter of pans and the hissed commands of the head chef. In her heart, she agreed with Sophia. The opulence was suffocating. It was a world away from her own quiet dream, a dream of a small sunlit bakery filled with the scent of fresh bread and the happy chatter of neighbors. A place called Mendoza's Pastries, where her art would be for everyone, not just the faceless, terrifyingly wealthy. That dream felt a million miles away, a fantasy she could only afford to visit in her thoughts, while her reality was catering gigs like this, working for people who saw her as little more than a pair of hands. She felt a familiar pang of frustration, the weight of student loans and the ever-increasing rent of her tiny apartment. This job, with its almost ludicrously high pay, was a necessary evil, a stepping stone she had to walk across to get to the life she actually wanted. She was a ghost here, a silent functionary, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She was here to do a job, to build her tower of pastry and pride, and then disappear back into her own world. Her pockets heavier and her dream a tiny bit closer. The head caterer, a man with a permanently flushed face and sweat beading on his brow, rushed toward her. "Mendoza, the dessert table needs a refresh. The lemon tarts are gone. Get out there, now." He didn't wait for a reply, already turning to shout at a busboy. Camila wiped her hands on her apron, her brief moment of peace shattered. She loaded a silver tray with glistening lemon tarts, their meringue peaks toasted to a perfect brown. Taking a deep breath to fortify herself against the wall of perfume and power she was about to walk into, she pushed through the swinging doors and into the gilded cage. The ballroom was even more breathtaking and horrifying than she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of guests dressed in silks and jewels. An orchestra played a soft, classical piece that was completely ignored by the murmuring crowd. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions. A veneer of celebration stretched thin over something cold and hard. On one side of the aisle sat the Moretti family, dark-suited and severe, watching the proceedings with the grim satisfaction of generals who had won a key territory. On the other, the Ricci family, flashier and louder, their expressions a mixture of pride and resentment. It was less a wedding and more a signing of a truce between two warring nations. At the altar, flanked by enormous arrangements of white roses that seemed to suck the very air from the room, stood the groom, Rafael Moretti. Even from a distance, his presence was magnetic. He was impossibly handsome in a tailored tuxedo that seemed molded to his broad shoulders. But it was the look on his face that made Camila pause. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, and his eyes, a startlingly deep shade of brown, were cold and empty. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he despised. Beside him, the bride, Isabella Ricci, was a vision in white lace and diamonds. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent features, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. There was a calculating glint in them, a triumphant possessiveness in the way she stood beside Rafael. She was a queen who had just captured the most valuable piece on the board, and she knew it. Camila moved quickly along the edge of the room, her head down, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She reached the dessert table, a lavish spread of sweets that now looked picked over and chaotic. As she carefully arranged the lemon tarts, replacing the empty platter, she could hear the officiant's voice droning on about unity and partnership. It was a symbolic part of the ceremony, just before the vows. Out of a flicker of curiosity she couldn't suppress, she glanced up. At that exact moment, Rafael Moretti's gaze broke from the altar. His eyes swept across the room, not seeing the powerful guests or the opulent decor, but searching for an escape. It was a look of such profound suffocation, of a man drowning in plain sight, that it struck Camila to her core. And then, his eyes found hers. The world tilted on its axis. The murmur of the crowd, the music from the orchestra, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. For a split second that stretched into an eternity, there was only the silent, desperate connection between the Mafia boss at the altar and the pastry chef in the corner. In his eyes, she didn't see a powerful importer or a fearsome groom. She saw a flicker of desperate, aching loneliness, a soul trapped behind walls of wealth and duty. He was just a man, and he was in pain. For Rafael, the sight of her was a sudden, sharp intake of breath after being held underwater for too long. In a room filled with performance and calculation, her simple, unassuming presence was a spark of raw authenticity. She wasn't looking at him with awe or fear or ambition. She was just looking at him. Her eyes, wide and dark and serious, held a quiet strength that cut through the suffocating fog of his life. He saw her, a woman with flour on her cheek and a smudge of chocolate on her apron, and for the first time all day, he felt real. He faltered. His hand, which had been resting stiffly at his side, hesitated for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible tremor, but it was enough. Isabella, whose attention had been fixed on the priest, felt the shift in him. Her eyes, sharp as shards of glass, darted to his face and then followed his gaze across the room. They landed on Camila. A flicker of disbelief, then a wave of cold, venomous fury washed over her features. Her eyes narrowed, a silent, deadly warning. The moment shattered. Camila, her heart hammering against her ribs, felt a hot flush of embarrassment and fear creep up her neck. She dropped her gaze to the floor, the intricate pattern of the marble, suddenly the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Her hands trembled as she placed the empty platter on the lower shelf of the cart. Without daring to look up again, she turned and fled, pushing back through the swinging doors into the relative safety of the kitchen's chaos. She leaned against the cool metal of the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The image of the groom's haunted eyes and the bride's murderous glare burned into her mind. She was shaken, confused, filled with a terrifying premonition that by simply meeting a stranger's gaze, she had somehow stumbled into the heart of a war she didn't understand. The kitchen was no longer a sanctuary. It was just the waiting room for a disaster she couldn't yet name. The reception was a symphony of falsehoods. The clinking of crystal glasses sounded like cracking ice, the forced laughter echoed like empty shells, and the air, thick with expensive perfume and cigar smoke, tasted of deceit. Rafael moved through it all like a phantom, a ghost at his own wedding feast. He had just completed the first dance with Isabella, a choreographed series of steps performed with technical precision and an absolute absence of feeling. Her hand had been a cold weight in his, her body stiff and unyielding against his own. Now, she clung to his arm, a beautiful, possessive anchor in a sea of sharks. His mind, however, was not in the ballroom. It was consumed by a single, searing image, the memory of a girl with flour on her cheek and honest eyes. The pastry chef. He replayed the moment endlessly, the sudden, shocking silence in the cacophony of his life when their gazes had locked. It was a connection so profound, so unexpected, it had physically jolted him. He had felt it like a key, turning in a lock he hadn't known was rusted shut. Now, his eyes, hooded and restless, continuously scanned the grand archways and service entrances, searching for her without a conscious command to do so. It was an instinct, a desperate, primal need to see her again, to confirm that the brief spark of authenticity he had witnessed was real and not a hallucination brought on by the suffocating pressure of the night. He needed another breath of that fresh air, another glimpse of a world that wasn't painted in shades of obligation and blood. Isabella sensed his distraction, her grip on his bicep tightening until her perfectly manicured nails dug into the fine wool of his tuxedo jacket. She leaned in, her voice a silken thread against his ear, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Smile, my dear," she murmured, her own lips stretched into a flawless, predatory smile for the benefit of a passing Ricci cousin. "Our families are watching. You look like you're at a funeral." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This is our victory, remember? Victory." The word was acid on his tongue. He looked at her, at the cold triumph in her eyes, and saw not a wife, but a warden. This was not a victory. It was a life sentence. The opulence of the ballroom, the glittering chandeliers, the mountains of food and rivers of champagne, it all felt like the lavish trappings of a gilded cage. He was an animal on display, a prize won in a war of attrition, and every moment he spent in this room, at her side, was another bar locking him in. He had to get out. He offered her a tight, meaningless smile, disentangling his arm from her grasp with a practiced smoothness. "I need some air," he said, his voice low and final, leaving no room for argument. He turned and walked away before she could protest, feeling her furious gaze burning into his back. Camila, meanwhile, felt trapped in the sweltering heat of the kitchen. The adrenaline from her flight from the ballroom had faded, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion and a deep, unnerving disquiet. The chaos of the kitchen, which had once been a comforting shield, now felt claustrophobic. Every clatter of a pan, every shouted order, grated on her raw nerves. She couldn't erase the image from her mind, the groom's haunted eyes, the bride's look of pure venom. It felt as though she had accidentally read the first page of a terrifying book she had no business opening. She needed silence. She needed space. Wiping her damp palms on her apron, she slipped out a side door, away from the noise and the heat, and found herself in the estate's sprawling, moonlit garden. The change was instantaneous. The air here was cool and clean, fragrant with the intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The frantic energy of the reception was replaced by the gentle, rhythmic splash of a marble fountain and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a sanctuary, a world away from the tension coiling inside the grand house. Camila walked slowly along a stone path, her shoulders gradually unknotting. She felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a place of serene beauty she had no right to enjoy. But the need for peace was stronger than her sense of unease. She reached the central fountain, a multi-tiered structure where water spilled from the hands of carved nymphs into a wide, shimmering basin. She sat on the cool stone edge, trailing her fingers in the water, watching the moonlight dance on its disturbed surface. She tried to empty her mind, to focus only on the sensation of the cold water on her skin, to forget the unsettling encounter with the groom, but his eyes were imprinted on the back of her eyelids. She felt a strange, unwelcome pang of sympathy for him, a man who seemingly had everything yet looked as if he had nothing at all. She felt out of place, not just in the garden, but in this entire strata of existence, and a deep, unsettling feeling told her she should never have come. Rafael made his way through the labyrinthine corridors of the West Wing, his steps quick and purposeful. He'd offered a curt, dismissive excuse to his new father-in-law, something about a private business call, and had escaped before the man could ask any questions. He didn't know where he was going, only that he was moving away from the ballroom, away from Isabella, away from the suffocating weight of his own name. He pushed open a set of heavy French doors and stepped out into the cool night air of the garden. And then he saw her. She was sitting by the fountain, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, her posture relaxed, her head tilted as she watched the water. She was unaware of his presence, a small, quiet figure in a world of noise. He stopped in the shadows of a large cypress tree, his heart giving a hard, painful thud against his ribs. He should turn around, he should walk away, and never look back. Approaching her was reckless, a breach of 1,000 unwritten rules. It was dangerous for him and, more importantly, for her. But his feet wouldn't obey. He was drawn forward by a force he didn't understand, a magnetic pull toward the only real thing he had seen all night. He approached quietly, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the stone path. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her more than necessary. "You're the pastry chef," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was softer than she would have expected, a low murmur that seemed to blend with the gentle sounds of the garden. Camila jumped, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with alarm. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively backing away, her hand flying to her chest as if to keep her heart from leaping out. It was him, the groom, here, alone. Her mind went blank with a fresh wave of intimidation and fear. "Yes," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I was just getting some air." He didn't move closer, respecting the space she had put between them. He turned his gaze to the fountain, the muscles in his jaw working silently. "This whole night," he confessed, his voice heavy with a weariness that went bone deep, "I felt like I couldn't breathe." He then turned his head and looked directly at her, and the cold mask from the altar was gone. His eyes were direct, unguarded, and filled with a surprising, devastating vulnerability. "You shouldn't be here," he said, the words hanging in the cool air between them. A statement of fact, a warning. He held her gaze for a long moment before adding, his voice dropping even lower, "But I'm glad you are." The raw honesty of his admission disarmed her. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a powerful, burgeoning curiosity. This was not the fearsome mafia boss Sophia had whispered about. This was a man drowning, and for some reason, he was telling her. The conversation that followed was brief, but it was charged with an intensity that made the air around them hum. He didn't ask about the wedding, about the families, about anything to do with the gilded cage he had just escaped. Instead, he asked about her. "The croquembouche," he said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It was a work of art." Camila was taken aback. "You noticed it?" "I notice things that are made with passion," he replied, his gaze unwavering. He asked about her pastries, about the way she spun sugar into delicate, impossibly thin threads. He listened with a focused intensity that was both unnerving and deeply flattering. It made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she never had been before. He didn't talk about himself, about his business, or his bride, but his profound unhappiness was a tangible presence, a silent third party to their conversation. Spurred on by his genuine interest, she found herself talking, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. She told him about her dream, the little bakery with the sunlit window, the scent of cinnamon and cardamom, the sound of a bell over the door. She spoke of Mendoza's pastries with a quiet passion, sharing details she rarely voiced even to Sophia. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a wistful, longing expression that made her heart ache. For those few minutes by the fountain, they were not a mafia boss and a caterer. They were just a man and a woman, two lonely souls who had found a fleeting moment of connection in a moonlit garden. High above them, on a stone balcony overlooking the garden, a man watched. Nico Ricci, Isabella's younger cousin, stood with a glass of whiskey in his hand, a scowl on his face. He had come out to escape his aunt's endless questions about his own marital prospects. He couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way the groom, his new cousin-in-law, was looking at the servant girl. He saw the intimacy in their posture, the charged space between them. He saw Rafael Moretti, the most powerful and feared man in their world, looking at a nobody caterer as if she were the only person on earth. A slow, malicious smile spread across Nico's face. He took a final sip of his whiskey, the ice rattling in the glass, and turned back toward the ballroom. Isabella would want to know about this. Down in the garden, the spell was broken by the distant sound of music swelling from the house. Camila became aware of where she was, of who she was with. The fear, which had receded, came rushing back. I should go, she said, her voice suddenly breathless. They'll be looking for me in the kitchen. Rafael's expression hardened slightly, the mask of the cold, powerful man slipping back into place. Yes, he said, his voice once again tight with control. You should. But as she turned to leave, he said her name, though she had never told it to him. Camila. She froze, her back to him. How did he know her name? Be careful, he said softly. It was not a threat, it was a plea. She fled without looking back, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this conversation was not an ending, it was a beginning. For Rafael, watching her disappear into the shadows, it was a confirmation. The conversation had been a lifeline, a moment of pure, uncalculated honesty that had solidified the vague, desperate impulse he'd felt at the altar into a firm, unshakable resolve. He could not, would not, go back into that ballroom and continue the lie. The treaty was broken, the war was coming, and it had all started with a single glance and a quiet confession by a fountain. Isabella was waiting for him. She wasn't in the grand hallway or the ballroom, where her absence would be noted. She stood just inside the door of his father's old study, a room of dark wood, cracked leather, and the lingering scent of cigars and secrets. The soundproofed room had witnessed generations of Moretti business, the signing of deals and the passing of sentences. It was a fitting stage for this confrontation. Her cousin Nico must have run to her the second he saw Rafael leave the garden. She had intercepted him with the precision of a predator, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The beautiful bride was gone, replaced by the true Isabella Ricci, a queen whose coronation had just been threatened. Who is she? Isabella's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the room like a shard of glass. There were no tears, no histrionics. Her anger was a cold, dense thing, far more terrifying than any scream. The help? You stand there? At our wedding? A ceremony solidifying a truce that has cost both our families millions, and you dare to humiliate me on our wedding night with a servant? Rafael closed the heavy oak door behind him, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The decision, which had been a desperate, formless impulse at the altar, had solidified into cold, hard certainty in the garden. He was no longer fighting it. He met her furious gaze without flinching. This has nothing to do with her, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised consequences. This has to do with me. With this. He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the distant sound of the party, at the entire charade of their union. I will not be a party to this lie. A flicker of genuine disbelief crossed her face, quickly replaced by a sneer. A lie? She scoffed, taking a step closer. Her magnificent white dress, a confection of lace and silk that had cost a fortune, rustled with her angry movement. It is not a lie, Rafael. It is a treaty written in ink and sealed with this ring. She held up her left hand, the enormous diamond flashing like a cold star. A treaty you just threatened by sneaking off into the garden with a pastry chef. Do you have any idea what you've done? You have no idea the war you are about to start over a nobody. She is not a nobody, he said, the words leaving his lips before he could stop them. The simple, quiet truth of it resonated in the silent room. To him, in that moment, she was the only somebody in the entire world. Isabella let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of all humor. Oh, I see. 10 minutes by a fountain and you're in love? How pathetic. You are a Moretti. You are the head of this family. You don't get to have feelings, you get to have power, and you are about to throw it all away. Her eyes narrowed, the cold fury condensing into pure venom. My father will not stand for this insult. He will see this as a declaration of war. He will burn your warehouses to the ground. He will bleed your businesses dry. He will come for everything you hold dear, and when he does, I will be there to watch it all burn, and I will remember that you chose a baker over an empire. The confrontation was exactly as he knew it would be, icy and brutal. It was not a lover's quarrel, it was a negotiation between two hostile powers, and one had just irrevocably broken the terms. He looked at her, at the beautiful, hateful woman he had almost bound himself to for life, and felt nothing but a profound sense of relief. The cage door was open. "Your father can do what he likes," Rafael said, his voice flat and final. "The wedding is off." He turned from her then, walking towards a private door that led to his own office, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room, a queen on a chessboard that had just been violently overturned. Her gasp of pure, unadulterated rage followed him, but he did not look back. After Isabella stormed out, her furious, whispered threats echoing in the soundproof study, Rafael stood alone for a long moment in the connecting office, the weight of his decision settling upon him like a physical shroud. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. He walked to the vast, bulletproof window that overlooked the glittering, indifferent city. Down below, the lights of cars moved like blood cells through the veins of the metropolis, each one carrying people with simple lives, simple problems, lives that were not his. He knew there was no going back. This wasn't just calling off a wedding, it was a deliberate act of provocation. He was reigniting a feud that had lain dormant for a decade, a peace bought with blood and treasure. He could already see the consequences laid out before him, a dark and violent path. He thought of his father, and his father before him, men who had lived and died by the codes of their world, a world built on power, loyalty, and brutal retribution. He was spitting on their legacy, on the very foundations of his family's power, all for a feeling, a connection with a woman he barely knew. But then he thought of the alternative, a lifetime with Isabella, a slow, suffocating death in a gilded cage, waking up every morning next to a woman who saw him as a business asset, a tool for her own ambition, living a lie, day after day, until he became the empty, haunted man he was destined to be. The thought of living that lie was infinitely worse than the thought of dying in a war. The memory of the garden, of Camila's quiet voice and honest eyes, was a beacon in the darkness of his thoughts. She had spoken of her dream, a small bakery, a simple, beautiful thing she wanted to build with her own hands. It was a dream so pure, so untainted by the filth of his world, that it had woken something in him he thought was long dead: hope. That night, in the garden, talking to her about something as simple as pastries, had been the first real choice he had made for himself in 20 years. He had not intended to drag her into his world, he had been selfish. But now that she was in, he would burn the world down to keep her safe. His resolve hardened. He was no longer the reluctant groom, the sacrificial lamb. He was Rafael Moretti, the head of the family, and he would protect what was his. He crossed the room to his secure desk, his movements now filled with a grim purpose. He picked up a dedicated encrypted phone and dialed a single number. It was answered on the first ring. "Marco," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Boss," the reply was calm, professional. Marco had been with him for 15 years, his most trusted man, his shadow, the one person who knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. "The wedding is off," Rafael stated. No preamble, no explanation. Marco would not need one. There was a beat of silence on the other end, not of surprise, but of processing. "Understood," Marco said, his voice unchanged. "What are your orders? Get the Rickies off my property. All of them. I want them gone within the hour. Use whatever force is necessary, but do it quietly. No gunfire on the estate grounds. I want this contained. This is a family matter, not a public spectacle." "It will be done," Marco said. Rafael paused, his gaze drifting back to the window. The most important order was last. "And Marco," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "find the girl from the catering team, the pastry chef. Her name is Camila Mendoza." He had made it his business to know her name the moment he returned from the garden. A simple call to the catering manager had been all it took. Find out everything about her, where she lives, where she works, her routine, and ensure she is safe. Put a watch on her, starting now, a discreet watch. She is not to be approached, not to be alarmed, but she is not to be touched. The Rixes will be looking for a target, for leverage. They will see her as the cause. I want 2 men on her around the clock. Am I clear? "Crystal clear, boss," Marco replied. I'll handle it personally. Good, Rafael said, and ended the call. He stood in the silent office, the distant, muffled sound of the dying party a world away. The die was cast. The war had begun, and in the heart of it all was a woman who had no idea she had just become the most important person in his life. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray wash against the dark sky as Camila and the rest of the catering team packed their van. They were bone-weary, their bodies aching from 16 hours on their feet, their minds numb with exhaustion. All they wanted was to go home, to fall into bed and forget the bizarre, tense atmosphere of the Moretti wedding. The party had died an unnatural death an hour ago, the music cut off abruptly, the guests leaving in a strange, hurried silence. Now, the estate was eerily quiet, the only sounds the clatter of their equipment and the chirping of early morning birds. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Raised voices, sharp and angry, erupted from the front of the mansion. The sound was followed by the slamming of car doors and the screech of tires on the gravel driveway. Camila and Sofia exchanged a wide-eyed, nervous glance. A frantic exodus had begun. Black sedans and expensive sports cars sped down the long, winding driveway, their headlights cutting sharp angles in the pre-dawn gloom. There was no laughter, no cheerful goodbyes, only grim, tight-lipped faces illuminated in the passing lights. "What is going on?" Sofia whispered, clutching a stack of empty trays to her chest. Before Camila could answer, a man in a dark suit approached them, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He was one of the Moretti household staff, a man whose presence radiated a quiet authority that had nothing to do with catering. He walked directly to their manager, a portly man named Jean-Pierre, who was nervously counting his serving platters. The man didn't speak. He simply handed Jean-Pierre a thick, unmarked envelope. Jean-Pierre's eyes widened as he felt its weight. "The event is over," the man in the suit said, his voice low and cold. "Mr. Moretti thanks you for your service. That is double your agreed-upon fee. You are to be off this property in 10 minutes. Leave whatever is not packed. Just go." Jean-Pierre, his face pale, could only nod, stuffing the envelope into his jacket pocket. "Yes, of course, right away." The order was relayed, and the team scrambled, a new, frantic energy taking hold. They tossed the remaining equipment into the van with a clatter, their exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a primal urge to flee. As their van rumbled down the driveway, joining the strange, angry procession of departing guests, Camila looked back at the magnificent mansion. And then she saw it. In the grand, arched doorway, illuminated by the cold light of the portico, stood Isabella Ricci, the perfect bride. Her billion-dollar dress was crumpled. A strand of pearls at her throat was broken, scattering like tiny frozen tears on the stone steps. Her face, which had been a mask of cold fury in the study, was now twisted into a rictus of pure, unrestrained rage. Her father, Don Ricci, a man whose face was a roadmap of violence and ambition, had her by the arm, his grip like iron. He was forcing her, physically dragging her, towards a waiting black limousine. She was resisting, her body rigid, her mouth open in a silent, furious scream. The wedding was over. It had imploded. "Oh my God, Cammy, did you see her face?" Sofia breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and terror. "What on earth happened? This is insane!" Camila couldn't speak. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic, trapped bird beating against her ribs. A cold, sinking feeling washed over her, a terrifying certainty that this chaos, this spectacular implosion of wealth and power, was somehow connected to her. It was connected to the man in the garden, the groom with the haunted eyes who had told her he couldn't breathe. She thought of his final words to her, the soft, urgent plea, asterisk, "Be careful." Asterisk. It hadn't been a warning about the kitchen staff or the treacherous driveway. It had been a warning about this, about him. The scale of the event, the sheer violence of its collapse, was dawning on her, and she was filled with a profound and suffocating dread. She had stumbled out of her world and into a war, and she had a sickening feeling that the war was about to follow her home. The next morning, the sun streamed through the single window of Camila's tiny apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The familiar, comforting scent of stale coffee and old books did little to soothe the frantic thrumming beneath her skin. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the night's events in a disjointed, feverish loop. The groom's haunted eyes, the bride's venomous glare, the chaos of the departure. She tried to dismiss it, to shrink it down into a bizarre anecdote she might one day tell Sophia over cheap wine. It was a story from another world, a world she had only visited for a night. She was home now, safe in her own reality. It had nothing to do with her. She repeated the words like a mantra, a desperate prayer for them to be true. She turned on the small television perched on her dresser, needing the mundane chatter of a morning news program to chase away the ghosts of the Moretti estate. She was greeted not by cheerful weather forecasts, but by the serious face of a business reporter. "We're following a developing story this morning," the reporter said, her expression grave. The highly anticipated wedding between Isabella Ricci, daughter of industrialist Donato Ricci, and Rafael Moretti, head of the powerful Moretti import-export conglomerate, was abruptly cancelled late last night. A picture of Rafael and Isabella, taken during their engagement, flashed on the screen. They were smiling, but their eyes were cold. Sources close to the families are citing irreconcilable differences, but financial analysts are speculating that the cancellation signals a complete breakdown in a major merger between the two family empires, a deal that was expected to consolidate significant power in the city's shipping and logistics sectors. The fallout from this failed alliance is predicted to have significant and potentially volatile market repercussions. Camila sank onto the edge of her bed, the coffee mug trembling in her hand. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a bizarre episode. It was real. The reporter's careful corporate language, industrialist, conglomerate, market repercussions, was a thin veil over the truth she had glimpsed in the garden. This wasn't about business, not really. It was about power, and she, a pastry chef with a dream of a small bakery, had somehow stumbled into the middle of a war between kings. The dread that had been a cold knot in her stomach since the van ride home now unfurled, spreading through her veins like ice water. This was not over. It was just beginning. A sense of profound unease followed her like a shadow throughout the day. She went to her job at a bustling downtown bakery, the familiar routine of kneading dough and piping icing usually a source of comfort and focus. Today, it felt like a pantomime of a life that was no longer hers. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she decorated a birthday cake. Her boss, a kind, flour-dusted woman named Elena, gave her a concerned look. "You all right, Cammy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Camila forced a weak smile and blamed it on a lack of sleep. The ghost was not in the bakery. It was parked across the street. A black sedan, sleek and expensive, with windows so darkly tinted they looked like voids. She first noticed it when she arrived for her shift, dismissing it as just another car in a busy city. But when she took a brief break in the afternoon, it was still there, parked in the exact same spot. A man in a dark suit sat behind the wheel, his face impassive, his gaze fixed forward. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. Paranoia began to prickle at the back of her neck. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that the events of the previous night had made her jumpy, but the feeling persisted, a low, constant hum of anxiety. As she walked to the bus stop after her shift, the evening crowd swallowing her up, she risked a glance over her shoulder. The black sedan was there, crawling through the thick traffic 2 car lengths behind her. It wasn't a coincidence. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was being followed. The feeling of being watched, of an unseen, unknown threat lurking just at the edge of her vision, was a violation. Her simple, anonymous life had been breached. The safe, predictable world she had built for herself was cracking, and she had no idea who these people were or what they wanted. Was it him, the groom? Was this his idea of protection? Or was it someone else, someone connected to the furious bride? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. In the opulent, gaudy headquarters of the Ricci family, a building designed to look like a Roman palace in the heart of the city, Donato Ricci was incandescent with a rage that was cold and absolute. The public dishonor was a stain on his name, a deep, personal insult that had also cost him a dynasty. His family had been publicly humiliated, his daughter sent home like a common tramp. He wanted to know why. His spies, men far more efficient than the Moretti security had given them credit for, had already delivered the answer. They had a name and a face. Camila Mendoza, a pastry chef, a nobody. They had followed her from the estate, tracked her to her pathetic little apartment, and watched her go to her menial job. Don Ricci stared at the grainy photograph of her on his desk, a candid shot of her leaving the bakery. She looked ordinary, plain even, her face etched with a weariness he recognized. She was not a beauty of Isabella's caliber. She had no money, no power, no connections. He could not comprehend it. He could not understand what could possibly make this woman special enough for Rafael Moretti to throw away an empire, to spit in the face of a decade-long truce. He did not want to start an all-out war with the Morettis, not yet. War was messy and expensive. He preferred a more surgical approach. He wanted leverage. He wanted the girl. He summoned two of his most trusted enforcers, men whose loyalty was to him and not to the broader family structure. "I have a task for you," he said, his voice a low growl. He pushed the photograph across the polished mahogany desk. "This is the girl, the Baker girl. I want her brought to me, unharmed." He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "I don't want her harmed, not yet. I want to look her in the eye when I find out what makes her special enough to cost me a dynasty. Find her, bring her to me, and do it quietly. The Morettis may be watching her. Be smarter than they are." The evening air was cool as Camila walked the final 2 blocks from the bus stop to her apartment. The street was quiet, lined with old brick buildings and the soft yellow glow of streetlights. The black sedan was nowhere in sight, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe she had imagined it all, a figment of her exhausted, overwrought mind. She clutched the strap of her bag, her keys already in her hand, her thoughts on a hot shower and a long, dreamless sleep. She was so lost in her own world that she didn't notice the 2 men until they stepped out of the darkened alley ahead of her, blocking her path. They were not dressed in suits. They were dressed like street thugs, in hoodies and baggy jeans, a deliberate attempt to look like a random mugging. But their eyes held a cold, professional focus that had nothing to do with petty crime. One was tall and thin, with a cruel, sneering mouth. The other was built like a refrigerator, his neck as thick as her waist. "Nice evening," the tall one said, his voice a slimy drawl. "A pretty girl like you shouldn't be walking alone." Camila's blood turned to ice. She froze, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She took a step back, her hand fumbling in her bag for her phone. "Don't bother with that," the big one grunted, taking a step to her left, cornering her against the brick wall of the alley. "We just want to talk. The boss wants to meet you." Before they could take another step, a screech of tires tore through the quiet street. The black sedan, the one that had been haunting her all day, materialized as if from nowhere, its headlights pinning the 2 men in their brilliant, blinding glare. The doors flew open and 2 figures emerged, moving with a swift, silent brutality that was terrifying to behold. It was the man from the car, the one in the suit, and another man, equally imposing. It was Marco. The confrontation was over before it truly began. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. There were no guns, no shouts, only the sickening thud of fists hitting flesh and a choked gasp of pain. Marco moved with a dancer's grace and a butcher's efficiency, deflecting a clumsy punch from the tall thug and striking him twice, sharp, debilitating blows to the throat and ribs that sent him staggering back, gasping for air. The other Moretti soldier dealt with the larger man, using his own momentum against him and slamming him into the brick wall with enough force to rattle the windows above. The Ricci thug crumpled to the ground, clutching a shoulder that was now bent at an unnatural angle, a silent, agonizing message. The tall one, seeing his partner incapacitated, scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness of the alley like the rat he was. The entire event had taken less than 10 seconds. The street was silent again, save for the low hum of the sedan's engine and the pained groans of the man on the ground. Marco straightened his suit jacket, his expression as calm and unruffled as if he had just concluded a business meeting. He then turned his attention to Camila. She was pressed against the wall, hyperventilating, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her paranoia had just been given a brutal, violent validation. The abstract threat was now terrifyingly real. Marco took a step towards her, his face calm but his eyes firm, showing her a small, leather-bound ID. "Miss Mendoza," he said, his voice steady, cutting through her panic. "My name is Marco. Mr. Moretti sent me. You are in danger." He gestured towards the open door of the sedan. "Please, you need to come with me now." His calm demeanor was more terrifying than the thug's aggression. It was the calm of a man completely in control of a situation she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The rescue was an abduction. He wasn't asking, he was telling. "Danger?" she choked out, her voice a raw, panicked squeak. She backed further along the wall, away from him, away from the car. "Who are you people? Leave me alone. This has nothing to do with me." Marco's expression softened with something that might have been pity, but his voice remained firm. "I'm afraid it does now," he said, taking another deliberate step closer. "You can either come with me, or you can wait for the next 2 men your new friends send. And I assure you, they will not be as easily discouraged." He had pulled her, irrevocably, into Rafael's world. Marco's words were a sentence, and the silent, terrifying ride in the black sedan was her journey to prison. The familiar streets of her neighborhood, the warm lights of corner stores and apartment windows, slid past the tinted glass like scenes from a movie she was no longer in. She was a ghost in her own city, spirited away into the night as the car descended into a private underground garage. She was led to a silent, waiting elevator that ascended with a smooth, stomach-dropping swiftness, the numbers climbing higher and higher until the doors opened directly into an apartment that stole her breath. It was less a home and more a statement, a stunning minimalist expanse of glass, steel, and polished concrete high above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the glittering urban sprawl below. Expensive, abstract art hung on the stark white walls, and the few pieces of furniture were sleek, modern, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. It was beautiful, it was breathtaking, and it was the coldest, most sterile place Camila had ever been. It was a luxurious prison, a gilded cage suspended in the sky, and the absolute antithesis of her own small, cluttered apartment, which, for all its flaws, was warm and alive and hers. Marco gestured towards a low-slung leather sofa. "Please," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He waited until she had perched hesitantly on the edge of the cushion before he spoke again, not wasting time with pleasantries. He sat in a chair opposite her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, and explained the situation in blunt, simple terms that stripped away all illusion. "Mr. Moretti is the head of the Moretti crime family," he began, the words landing like stones in the silent room. "His business is not just import-export, that is a fraction of it." He let that sink in, watching her face. Camila felt a wave of nausea. She had known, on some level, but hearing it stated so plainly was different. The wedding to Isabella Ricci was not about love. It was a business alliance, a truce with a rival family, the Rixes. By calling it off, Mr. Moretti has broken that truce. In their world, that is an act of war. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Because you were the last person he was seen with, because he broke the engagement after speaking with you. Don Ricci, Isabella's father, sees you as the cause. He believes you are either Mr. Moretti's weakness or his leverage. Either way, he wants you. The men on the street tonight were his. They were sent to take you to him. They will not be the last." The information was a tidal wave of terrifying facts that crashed over her, drowning her. Her simple life, her dream of a bakery, her anonymity, it had all been erased, destroyed. Not by some grand tragic accident, but because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, because a powerful man had looked at her. The fear that had been a cold, solid lump in her chest began to melt, heated by a dawning, white-hot anger. The sheer, staggering injustice of it all was a poison in her veins. Marco seemed to sense the shift. "Mr. Moretti is handling the situation. You will be safe here. No one can get to you here. He stood, his duty done. There is food in the kitchen. The television works. Make yourself comfortable. He will be here later. He walked to the elevator, the doors sliding open to receive him, and then he was gone, leaving her utterly alone in the vast, silent cage. Later that night, after hours spent pacing the cold concrete floors like a trapped animal, Camila stood at the vast window, staring down at the city that no longer felt like hers. The sound of the private elevator arriving made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. The doors slid open, and he was there. Rafael Moretti. The dynamic was completely, terrifyingly altered. This was not the sad, handsome stranger from the garden, his eyes filled with a desperate vulnerability. This was the man Marco had described, the head of a crime family. A powerful, dangerous man who had shattered her life with a single, selfish decision. He held her life in his hands, and the realization sent a surge of defiant rage through her, eclipsing her fear. He looked weary, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes, when they found hers, were just as intense as she remembered. He took a step into the room, shrugging off his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair. "Camila," he began, his voice low, "who do you think you are?" She cut him off, her own voice a blade, shaking but sharp. She took a step towards him, fueled by the fury that had been building for hours. "You talked to me for 10 minutes in a garden. 10 minutes. And now men are trying to grab me on the street? My life, my simple, quiet, normal life, is gone. You've destroyed my life." The words hung in the air, echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't flinch, he didn't argue. He simply stood there and took it, his expression a mixture of regret and grim acceptance. He let the silence stretch, letting her anger wash over him. "I know," he said finally, his voice heavy with a sincerity that caught her off guard. "And I am sorry for what you have been put through, for the fear you've felt, for all of this." He gestured at the opulent prison around them. "But I am not sorry for calling off the wedding." The argument that followed was raw and desperate. She threw her anger at him, her frustration, her terror, and he absorbed it all, never raising his voice, never making excuses. He let her rage until she was spent, until her words devolved into choked, frustrated sobs, and she sank onto the sofa, her face in her hands. He moved closer then, sitting not beside her, but on the edge of a coffee table in front of her, keeping a respectful distance. He waited until her sobs subsided into ragged breaths. "I never chose this life," he said quietly, his voice raw with an exhaustion that seemed to come from his very soul. "I was born into it. It's a legacy of violence and obligation passed down from my father and his father before him. For 20 years, every choice has been made for me. Who to do business with, who to kill, who to marry. I've been a ghost in my own life, a king in a kingdom I never wanted." He looked at her, and for a moment, the powerful Mafia boss vanished, and she saw him again, the lonely man from the garden. "That night," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "in the garden, talking to you about something as simple as pastries, about your dream. It was the first real thing I had felt in years. It was the first real choice I have made for myself in 20 years. I never intended to drag you into this. I was selfish. I saw a flicker of light and I reached for it, without thinking of the consequences for you. But now that you are in, I will burn the world down to keep you safe." He stood up and walked to a sleek, minimalist desk against one wall. He returned with 2 items, which he placed on the coffee table in front of her. A passport, its cover a deep, anonymous blue, and a bank card. "I am giving you back a choice," he said, his voice regaining some of its command. "That passport has a new name. The bank account connected to that card contains $1 million. There is a flight leaving for Lisbon tomorrow morning. You can get on it. You can walk out that door, and I give you my word, no one will ever find you. The Rixus will never find you. I will never find you. You can have a new life, build your bakery, be free of all of this." He paused, letting the weight of his offer settle in the air. "Or," he said, his gaze locking with hers, intense and unwavering, "you can stay, here, in this city, where I can protect you." Camila stared at the passport and the bank card. $1 million. The number was so large it was abstract. It was more money than she could have dreamed of earning in a lifetime. It was freedom. It was the keys to Mendoza's pastries, not as a distant dream, but as a tangible reality. It was a plane ticket away from the violence, the fear, the man standing before her who was both her captor and her protector. Every rational part of her, every instinct for self-preservation, screamed at her to take the money and run, to disappear, to save herself. But to run was to let them win, to let Don Ricci and his thugs chase her from her home, from her life, to let Rafael Moretti, with all his power and wealth, solve the problem of her by throwing money at it, shipping her away like inconvenient cargo. She looked up from the passport and met his eyes. She saw the man from the garden, the man who spoke of being a ghost in his own life, the man who had just offered her an escape he himself could never have. And in that moment, a spark of defiance, hot and fierce, ignited within her. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn to be moved around a board by powerful men. After a long, tense silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, she pushed the passport and the bank card back across the table towards him. Her hand was perfectly steady. "I'm not running," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my city. This is my life." She lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "I'm staying." Raphael stared at her, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He had expected tears, arguments, maybe even gratitude. He had expected her to take the money. Everyone took the money. No one ever chose to willingly step into his world when offered a clean way out. He saw her, really saw her then, not as a fragile spark of light he needed to protect, but as a woman with a core of steel he had never anticipated, a quiet, profound respect. Something he had not felt for anyone in a very long time, dawned in his eyes. She had just made a choice that was braver and perhaps more foolish than anything he had ever done, and in doing so, she had bound herself to him more tightly than any wedding vow ever could. The game had changed. She was no longer just a bystander he had to protect. She was a player who had just refused to leave the board. Camila's decision hung in the air, a quiet defiance that shifted the very foundation of their strange, forced relationship. For a long moment, Raphael simply stared at her, the shock on his face so profound it was almost comical. He had built an empire on his ability to predict the actions of his enemies and allies, to understand the levers of fear and greed that moved the world. But this woman, this pastry chef with flour in her soul and steel in her spine, was utterly, maddeningly unpredictable. The respect he felt was a foreign sensation, a warmth spreading through his chest that was both unnerving and exhilarating. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, accepting her choice, accepting the new, dangerous path they were now on together. The fragile peace of this new understanding was shattered less than an hour later. Marco appeared at the elevator door, his face grim, holding a tablet. He didn't speak. He simply turned the screen towards Raphael. It was a live newsfeed. A warehouse complex by the city's industrial port was engulfed in flames, thick black smoke billowing into the night sky, a funeral pyre against the stars. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Blaze at Moretti-owned warehouse, arson suspected." It was one of the legitimate warehouses, Marco said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. Textiles, millions of dollars in merchandise, all gone. He paused, his gaze flicking to Camila, who stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. They left a message, painted on the wall of the building opposite. "The girl for the business. It's an ultimatum." The air crackled with a new, terrifying tension. Don Ricci, enraged that he could not get to Camila, had made his move. It was bold, bloody, and public. He was no longer trying to be surgical. He was setting fires. The next morning, the boardroom at the Moretti headquarters was a chamber of hushed anxiety. Raphael sat at the head of the long, polished table, his face carved from stone. His top lieutenants, the capos who ran his various enterprises, sat around him, their expressions ranging from nervous to openly hostile. A war over a civilian was bad for business. It was messy, unpredictable, and drew the kind of attention they all sought to avoid. "He burns one of our warehouses, a legitimate front, and makes demands?" One of the older capos, a man named Leo, grumbled. "This is because of the girl. It's a distraction. We should give him what he wants, Handle it quietly. Give him the girl? Marco, standing behind Rafael's chair, spoke for the first time, his voice dangerously soft. You would hand over someone under this family's protection to a man like Ricci? That is not quiet, Leo. That is weakness. And weakness is an invitation to extinction. Rafael raised a hand, and the room fell silent. He let the silence stretch, his cold gaze sweeping over each man at the table, weighing their loyalty, their fear. Leo is right about one thing, he said finally, his voice a low, chilling whisper that carried more weight than any shout. This is no longer about a girl. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Leo's. This is about a direct attack on our family. Don Ricci has spit in our face. He has burned my property. He thinks we are weak. He thinks he can dictate terms to us. He stood up, his presence filling the room, a predator uncoiling. There will be no war, he declared, his voice ringing with cold fury. Wars are costly and unpredictable. There will only be a conclusion. Ricci has shown his hand. Tonight, I will show him mine. He left the room without another word, leaving his men in a stunned, fearful silence. His authority had been challenged, and he had reasserted it with absolute terrifying finality. Before he left to handle the situation, he returned to the penthouse. He found Camila by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the city below as if it were an alien landscape. She had seen the news. She knew the fire was because of her. The terror was a living thing in her eyes. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the room. I have to go out, he said, his voice softer than it had been in the boardroom. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. Are you going to? She couldn't finish the sentence. He understood. I am going to end this, he said, his gaze direct and unwavering. He stepped closer, and this time he did touch her, his hand gently taking her arm. Her skin was cold. Tonight, when I come back, it will be over. You will be safe. I promise you. The promise was an oath, sworn not just to her, but to himself. It was the only thing that mattered. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a high-end restaurant in the financial district that Rafael's family had secretly owned for decades. It was closed for a private event. Don Ricci arrived flanked by two of his men, his face a mask of smug confidence. He expected a negotiation. He expected Rafael, his business literally in flames, to be ready to bargain. He believed he held all the cards. He thought he was coming to collect his pound of flesh, perhaps even demand that Rafael hand over the girl. He was wrong. Rafael was not there to negotiate. He sat alone at a large table in the center of the empty dining room, a single file folder resting on the white tablecloth in front of him. He looked calm, almost relaxed. He gestured for Don Ricci to sit. You have made a grave error, Donato, Rafael began, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. Ricci scoffed. I think it is you who has made the error, boy. You threw away an empire for a baker. Now, you will pay the price. Rafael smiled, a cold, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. An empire? He mused. It's hard to rule an empire when your own house is rotten from the inside out. He slid the file folder across the table. Open it. Confused, but still arrogant, Ricci opened the folder. Inside were pages of bank statements, transcripts of recorded conversations, photographs. Irrefutable, damning proof. It showed that his own second-in-command, a man he had trusted like a son for 20 years, had been skimming millions from him for the last 5. It showed that this same man, when contacted by Marco 2 days prior, had been more than willing to sell out his boss, to hand over every detail of the Ricci operation in exchange for his own life and a guarantee that he could take over what was left after the dust settled. Ricci's face went from smug to confused to ashen white as he flipped through the pages. The blood drained from his face. He had been crippled, his entire organization compromised from within, and he had never even seen the blade coming. Rafael hadn't fired a single shot. He had simply exposed the rot that was already there. You came after someone under my protection, Rafael said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You broke the peace. You thought you could burn my house down, but your own house was already collapsing. He stood up, looming over the broken man. So this is what will happen. You will retire, effective immediately. You will move to Florida, or Arizona, or whatever sunny corner of the world you wish to die in. You will disappear. Your territory, your businesses, your men, they are now mine. If I ever hear your name again, if you ever set foot in this city again, the next conversation we have will be our last. Defeated, exposed, and utterly broken, Don Ricci had no choice. He stared at the file, at the evidence of his own failure, and nodded slowly, a man aging 20 years in 20 seconds. The threat was neutralized. Rafael returned to the penthouse as the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the city. He was weary, the long night etched on his face, but he was victorious. Camila was asleep on the sofa, curled up under a cashmere throw, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time in days. He watched her for a long moment, a strange, protective ache in his chest. He gently touched her shoulder, and her eyes fluttered open. She sat up, instantly alert, the fear returning to her eyes. It's over, he said simply, his voice rough with exhaustion. You're safe. The relief that washed over her was so profound it was almost painful. The tension that had held her rigid for days finally released its grip, and she began to tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of it. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, and this time, when he reached for her, she did not pull away. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her life. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They walked to the balcony and stood together, hand in hand, watching the sun come up, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It wasn't a passionate embrace, but a quiet, profound moment of connection. The external threat was gone, leaving only the two of them and the complex, uncertain reality of their situation. The future was a dangerous, unknown country, but for the first time, it felt like it was theirs to choose together. A few months later, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint had replaced the sterile air of the penthouse. Camila stood in the middle of a bright, airy commercial space, a sun-drenched corner unit with huge windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street. She held a blueprint in her hand, a wide smile on her face, as she sketched a small change to the counter layout. A beautifully designed sign, not yet hung, leaned against a wall. In elegant flowing script, it read, Mendoza's Pastries. Rafael had kept his word. He had funded it, no questions asked, through a series of legitimate investment companies so clean they squeaked. It was hers. Her dream, being built from the ground up. He visited often, not as a landlord or a benefactor, but as a quiet observer, a man fascinated by a world so different from his own. The dynamic between them had shifted again, from protector and protected to something softer, more genuine. An unconventional, complicated couple finding their footing on new ground. He was still a dangerous man, and their world would never be simple, but their relationship, born from a single glance across a crowded room, had become the new, strange, and wonderful center of both their lives. He walked in that afternoon, carrying a small box from a rival bakery. He placed it on a dusty workbench, a teasing glint in his eye. Market research, he said, his lips twitching into a rare, genuine smile. She laughed, a sound that was free and happy. She opened the box and took out a simple almond croissant. She broke it in two and handed him a piece. They stood there, in the middle of her unfinished bakery, the city humming outside, sharing a simple pastry. It was a new beginning, not a fairy tale ending. It was messy and complicated and under construction, but it was real, and it was theirs.